Hi, could you all please take your seats because we'd like to get started? Thank you.
Yes. So when you throw it, could you just say Marcel, or could you say,
Yes.
you know,
Yes. If Marcel
throw the
and
first name,
I will-
just throw
yes.
me the first name and
Yeah.
I'll grab it.
Yeah.
Give me 1 second to get back to this.
Okay. Okay, is Marcel or Carlos here? Okay, great. Guy, we're going to ask you to come up to the panel so we can get started. Jeff King. Okay, well, hopefully you are all here for the press freedom dimensions of internet freedom. And again, if I can ask you to please take your seat so we can get started. We have only 1 hour.
So I've got that little copy downloaded.
Yeah, they said they have it. Yep.
They asked this room to be a little quiet from the next room.
And where do you want me to sit?
You can sit right here.
Can I take the bag?
It's not mine, but
Oh, I thought it was yours. Is Jeff King here? Okay. Marcel, hi. Courtney, how are you? Please sit here.
Sure.
Okay, it's going to be Marcel, Carlos? Hi. Okay, Carlos and then Marcel, because I just told the moderator what order we're sitting in. You'll have to find one. Okay, so in the interest of time, since we have less than an hour, I'd like to go ahead and get started. And could I ask you to please keep your conversations down? Thank you so much. Huh? Sure. Okay. So thank you very much for joining us at the Press Freedom Dimensions of Internet Governance Roundtable. I do hope this will be a roundtable and we won't just be sitting here talking at you. So I look forward to everyone's participation. This panel came out of the idea that revelations about mass surveillance, about mass data collection over the past year has underscored the fact that the practice of journalism and the circulation of information more broadly is inseparable from key dimensions of internet governance, from the infrastructure backbone to transmission dynamics to encryption. And the past year's headlines have made it clear that both policy changes and technological efforts are necessary to address the protection of journalists, the protection of communication and information exchange amid aggressive government surveillance and private sector complicity, and in order to ensure that all actors respect the rule of law, privacy, and free expression. As canaries in the data coal mine, journalists represent one of the most vulnerable and engaged group of internet users, and what happens to journalists and journalism will likely foreshadow other broader developments. Yet to what extent do different stakeholder groups understand the critical importance of their input to internet governance and what this plays in sustaining an environment in which press freedom and freedom of expression more broadly is possible? My name is Courtney Radge. I'm the Advocacy Director for the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is a nonprofit organization that works to protect press freedom globally. And we have organized this roundtable to explore the various stakeholders' roles in resisting mass surveillance, particularly of journalists and media, and how internet governance choices may impact on press freedom. As Laura DeNardis has explained, press freedom is dependent on the internet infrastructure, policies to preserve liberty and infrastructure reliability, and freedom to gather and disseminate information. Surveillance, net neutrality, core internet values, access dynamics, and a host of other issues are relevant. And I think what we want to do here is to tease out how, why, and what the role of various stakeholders will be to add value to this broader community. So we're a press freedom organization. We're part of IFEX, which is a big global network of press freedom organizations. And I think a lot of press freedom organizations and journalists and media organizations are trying to figure out how to engage in internet governance. What are their entry points? What are the most salient issues? Are they the technical infrastructure and architecture, net neutrality? What are the press freedom dimensions of net neutrality? It involves actors, including governments, private sector, companies, technologists, intergovernmental organizations, civil society groups, the architectural control, institutional mechanisms such as treaties and national laws, the management of information flows, national legal frameworks, and technologically mediated policy enactment, intermediate liability, private corporate policies, surveillance, the Internet of Things, what happens to source protection there, tracking, anonymity policies. I mean, there are a whole host of issues, and what we want to do at this panel is to talk about what some of those key issues are. And I'm going to introduce my panelists here, and we're saying panelists, but I've asked each of them to just talk about the one or two most salient issues that they feel are important to the press freedom dimensions of Internet governance, and then I hope that we can have a discussion, and I hope that if you have something to add, you will raise your hand, throw that in, and if you have a question, I hope that you'll ask that. And the goal is not necessarily to have answers, but to help define the agenda for a better understanding of this issue and for studying the press freedom dimensions of Internet governance. So I think that I'd like to start with Guy Berger, who is the director of the Communications and Information Freedom of Division, Freedom of Information section at UNESCO. And UNESCO is obviously one of the key leaders in this arena in terms of its role both on the normative and the policy side with WSIS, with the IGF, with all of the internet studies that it's doing. And so I'd like you to kind of start by giving us your perspective on what UNESCO sees as the press freedom dimensions of internet governance. And I'm going to give you 3 to 5 minutes to start, and then we'll go to each of our panelists up here for about 2 minutes each. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Courtney. I think everyone here probably knows in the UN system, it's UNESCO that should be promoting press freedom. And what is press freedom? That's an interesting question. And what is internet governance, and how do these two things interconnect? So that's what I'll look at. So very quickly, press freedom from a UNESCO point of view, I'll go into that. We don't use it as a synonym for media freedom because we see it as wider than the media freedom, and it's also narrower than general freedom of expression. I'll elaborate a little bit on that. I'll speak a bit about UNESCO internet governance. I'm going to focus especially on this question of confidential sources and how that is at the center of press freedom and internet governance. And I'll speak particularly about what is the role of the media in multi-stakeholder governance of this question of confidential sources. So press freedom, if you take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, freedom of expression is everybody's right to seek, impart, receive. It says that the rights can be limited, as you all know, must be necessary, proportionate, transparent, etc. So that's for everybody, okay? Press freedom, in terms of the UNESCO understanding, which we elaborated, me and Courtney, in this publication that Courtney edited, which you can find on the internet, called World Trends in Freedom of Expression. Press freedom is really the use of freedom of expression on a media platform, okay? We also elaborate further that it's not just the freedom side to use that media, it's also a question of, if you really wanted, pluralism and independence. And within that, finally, you have journalism. So not all freedom of expression is journalism. Okay, but journalism is a specialized form of freedom of expression, including by non-traditional actors. So press freedom, you can see where we're coming from in that perspective. Now, let's just take internet governance, then I'll try and marry these two. At UNESCO, we've developed this draft position, which is called Internet Universality, and it's based on ROAM. It says the internet should be human rights-based, should be open, should be accessible, and multi-stakeholder. In particular now, I'll speak about the two quadrants, the two principles, the R and the M. Okay, so how do these relate to these questions of press freedom? If you look at the issues around journalism and governance issues, who governs these issues, these are some of the issues related to the internet. Confidentiality I'll come to as the main one, but there are all these issues also, lots of governance issues in this question, which is directly about the expression side of freedom of expression. Everyone knows about permissionless innovation, so what about permissionless publishing or licensed publishing? That's another big issue that's happening in several countries. It's a governance issue. Anonymity is a governance issue. Right to be forgotten is a governance issue. And the secrecy of sources, that's what I want to speak about, because how can you have secrecy of sources when there are digital footprints all over the place? So at UNESCO, the governments agreed in December 2013 this particular statement, where they said Now, that's saying there's one thing, what happens after there's another thing, but it's quite significant. They said, privacy is essential to protect journalism sources. They explained why, because that's how society benefits from investigative journalism, and privacy should not be subjected to arbitrary or unlawful interference. That's quite a significant thing that the UN said. So the question that raises is, can there be a kind of governance that produces limits on how third parties can collect or use journalists' data, especially the data that they would prefer to keep confidential? It may not be secret because it's all there and somebody's various intermediaries are keeping it, but can it be confidential? So we're doing a research study exactly on these questions, one of which is being done by the World Association of Newspapers, WAN-IFRA. And they are looking, more than 100 countries around the world have some source protection dispensation. Do those source protection dispensations take into account non-traditional journalists who are trying to protect sources? And do those protections cover digital data? So we're making that assessment. This will be extremely interesting because when you have that information, you could say to what extent you need to update those kind of regimes. Next year, I would say we'll have a full conference on this full study, which is on lots of issues besides this issue. But please monitor, and if you can come to Paris, do come to that. So my last point about multi-stakeholderism on this thing. According to that perspective that we developed, that quadrangle, that quadrant, when you're limiting or balancing rights, what is the role of the press freedom constituency? This is where the M for multi-stakeholder comes in. So should these issues be decided only by governments, or should they be decided by a multi-stakeholder mechanism? Policy making and oversight. And I would just remind you, in November last year, the UN General Assembly agreed, every country there, agreed that each country should review its surveillance legislation and see if it's adequately transparent and has adequate independent oversight. Should the media try, the press or bloggers, should they try and become part of these oversight mechanisms precisely to ensure that the governance decisions that are being made about source protection impact on them? So that's more or less what I've got to say. The point is that today we have many more stakeholders safeguarding press freedom. Everybody in society is an indirect stake. I think that I would also just sensitize those of you who don't know, the 2nd of November is the International Day to End Impunity. It's a great time to focus attention on these issues, whether it's offline impunity, but now we're talking about particular impunity in this context. Who is committing crimes against freedom of expression in the online environment, and how can we use this day to ensure they don't get away with it? Courtney, I think that sums up what I've done. Press freedom, freedom to publish, wider than traditional press, special use of press freedom, governance, you can bring these principles and norms to bear. Journalism needs some governance in these areas to protect the inputs and the outputs. And source confidentiality, I think that this is a key issue, a digital issue where multi-stakeholderism can be applied. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now turn to Carlos Afonso Pereira de Souza, who is replacing one of our other panelists who was on the panel, Ronaldo, and represents the academic community. And can I turn to you for about 2 minutes of comments? Thank you.
Okay. So, hi, can you guys hear me? So, thanks, Courtney, for the invitation to join this panel. I'll be very quick, and I would like to just to come up from Guy's presentation, I would like to just comment on 3 issues that I think that in terms of governance and regulation of internet definitely has some impact on the activity of journalists and the freedom of press in general. So the first one is I will talk about at least 2 trends in tech policy, or more specifically on internet policy. First one is data localization. We have been going through a lot of discussions on data localization recently and the internet fragmentation, and I think most of you are quite well known on this subject. My concern here is there's not many people linking the discussion on data localization with press freedom. Because the thing is, if you end up having the mandatory provision in some type of legislation in the national level that would oblige the data to be stored locally, this could be something that could put in danger journalists and dissenting voices in some specific countries. We had in Brazil last year a big discussion on that because we were about to approve our own Internet Bill of Rights in Brazil that ended up being approved without a data localization provision, but that was a huge and a fierceful discussion down in Brazil. So my concern is if you have the mandatory provision that obliges data to be stored locally, that would make easier for non-democratic governments to have access to the data of opposing voices on journalists and bloggers. So I think it's important for us to make this connection between data localization and freedom of the press. Second issue is an issue concerning proportionality and the blocking of entire platforms. We have been going through a lot of case law on that, in which because you have one specific article, one specific photo, one specific video that causes harm, this is the sole cause for judges or even executive power to determine that the whole platform being taken down, being blocked in a specific country. So I think this is another topic in trends in internet policy that we need to address and to make connection with freedom of press. If you end up blocking an entire platform, you definitely will have a great impact on not only freedom of expression as a whole, but definitely on freedom of the press. And my third point, and with that I sum up, is not that much related to internet governance as a whole, but definitely on internet regulation, which is something that has been featured in Frank LaRue's report for a while now, which is the feature of having honor being criminalized if you infringe the honor of someone else. So we have the criminalization of offenses to honor, of defamation, in a number of countries, and that is something that clearly puts in peril journalists and dissenting voices because they can be sent to jail and not only like face damages lawsuit being brought against them, but actually being detained and sent to jail. So this is something that happens in Brazil. We have a provision on crimes against honor, on defamation, and I think this is something that's interesting for us to bring in the international level in internet governance debates, because we are pretty much used to discuss hate speech and how to avoid hate speech in the international level. We have to take extra care here not to, when discussing hate speech and how to combat hate speech, end up enforcing or creating incentives for other provisions on crimes against honor to be enforced in a national level. So those will be my three comments on those issues. Data localization, the need to address proportionality in blocking platforms, and the issue of criminalizing defamation in the national level, and the impacts for freedom of the press. So sorry to speak a little bit quickly. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fantastic. I'd like to now turn to Wrapup Ben Hassin from the Arab region representing civil society. Could you give us your thoughts, about 2 minutes?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Wrapup Ben Hassin. I am civil society rights activist from Tunisia. I would like to follow on what my colleague Guy here was talking about in regards to the freedom to publish is indeed wider than the freedom of expression. And I think in terms of the Arab world, that's exactly what certain governments are attacking, which is the freedom to publish. And when you put the freedom to publish in danger, naturally the freedom of expression is already jeopardized. And so one of the biggest issues in the Arab world, at least, is that there is a lack of a bridge between civil society and governments or regulatory authorities to actually work together in regards to showing that publication laws can't be used online. So one of the main issues we have in the Arab world is that we have old arcane laws, or in some countries, cases such as Jordan, very new laws that attempt to categorize media sources as whether they are journalist sources or anything else. And that lack of categorization, or these very, very arbitrary types of categorization, end up jeopardizing civil societies and citizens' rights to express themselves, whether it's online or offline. And I'll go ahead and use the example very briefly of Jordan, which Actually, one of our colleagues here is in this room from Hebber.com or Hebber.org or Hebber.me or Hebber.net because they have been switching their domain names over and over again because the government is attempting to categorize this website, which is a citizen media website, as a journalist website. And they have been continuously blocked in Jordan because they are supposedly not they don't fit into some categorization of media. And in order for them to actually be online, the government is saying that they need to get a license, and that license requires them to be part of the Jordan Press Association for 4 years. It also requires them to get this license from the Media Commission, which is a very difficult process, but it's also just based in September. It was founded in September 2012, which is very recent. And these are the types of dynamics that we see happen in the Arab region as well as other regions where very arbitrary categorization laws that particularly deal with press offline are being used to regulate press online or freedom of expression online. And I think that bridge between, first of all, offline and online is not there, and the bridge between civil society and governments is not there as well. And so I'll go ahead and wrap up, but I look forward to your questions later on and we can further discuss as well.
Thank you. So it sounds like if we kind of take out the main issues you're talking about, could be domain name blocking, licensing, and then the appropriate legal regulatory context. And again, going back to what Guy said, multi-stakeholder involvement in this arena. Thank you. I'd now like to turn to Marcel Leonardi, the Public Policy Senior Counsel from Google Brazil.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody, for inviting me. Thanks for your attention here. In connection to what has already been said with the freedom to publish, I'd like to emphasize the importance of understanding the protection of platforms themselves as a key part of freedom of the press. The reason for that is, from the Brazilian experience, we have lived without any kind of safe harbors for these platforms for quite a while. Marco Seville finally introduced them this year, and the difference is really night and day. I mean, before the existence of these protections for platforms, pretty much every single platform, except for a few ones, when they received any kind of notice for content takedown, they basically took everything down, no questions asked, because they were fearing the liability that could accrue from not complying with those requests. And even the courts in Brazil have been introducing this idea that whenever somebody sends you a notice about something that's allegedly wrong, allegedly illegal, then platforms should take that content down immediately, otherwise they would face liability. So from a freedom of press standpoint, journalists that have blogs, citizen journalists, and every kind of person that dealt with online media pretty much was always fearful what was going to happen with their content. It could be taken down without any kind of notice, with no transparency whatsoever. So the good news is, at least in our context, Marco Seville did change that. It did institute safe harbors for these platforms. The bad news, though, is something that a new trend that we have been watching, not only in Brazil but elsewhere, attacks on anonymity per se. So we have seen scenarios not only in Brazil but elsewhere in which certain applications, like mobile applications that could be used for sharing any kind of anonymous information, were being banned just because they had that functionality, with no regards whatsoever to the content itself that was being published via these platforms. The idea being that just because a platform allows for anonymity, then the platform itself, the application itself, would be deemed illegal. There was an injunction in Brazil against one such application recently called Secret, and if you extended reasoning to pretty much everything, we would have to close down the web. I mean, pretty much any kind of Web 2 can be used in that sense. So it's a very worrying and disturbing trend that we have perceived. And finally, I think it's important to highlight the importance of transparency for any kind of removal. Basically, whenever we see these scenarios in which why content was removed, what was happening, what exactly content was removed, the only way that journalists and society itself can scrutinize and understand what has happened is for companies to have transparency reports and explain why a certain piece of content was removed, according to what kind of legal process, and so on and so forth. So what's interesting to notice is there was some resistance to that in certain countries, but companies are still doing that regardless. For example, Brazil is facing an election this year, presidential election, and there is a website called Transparency in the Elections that is actually putting a catalog of all kinds of content takedown requests that the candidates are putting out. So basically, any kind of new lawsuit, any kind of injunction that people get to take down content, journalistic content from the web, is being reported in that kind of website. So it's much easier for citizens, for pretty much anybody that's going to vote, to understand which candidates are asking for content takedown and why. So these would be the 3 key points I would emphasize: intermediary liability protection, the worrying, disturbing trend on attacks on anonymity, and the need for transparency in regards of what is being taken down.
Thank you. Great summary. Is Jeff King in the room? He's supposed to... Oh, okay, good. I've been looking for you.
Not only that, but I have a chair.
Great.
I'm sorry to all of you
Okay.
who don't have chairs. We're not
Okay,
here, right?
so Jeff King is with the Committee to Protect Journalists, and he's going to give us the perspective from civil society, press freedom perspective.
Sure, thank you, Courtney. So I would actually preface this by saying that I agree with everything that's been said so far. Thank you. Is it? Thanks. I agree with everything that's been said so far, and I think that there's one overarching point, which is that many of the issues we're going to face are not necessarily issues that are flowing from malicious intent even, although we will certainly be facing many of those. And I think we talked about some of those at the last panel about hacking and surveillance and self-help steps that people can take, and governments and intergovernmental organizations and corporations could take to protect people. But here I think that many of the issues that we're going to be facing are potentially ones of our own creation, ones that we are seeking to promulgate and push to solve what are admittedly enormous problems, but create massive cascading issues of unintended consequences. And so I will give, I think, just 2 examples. The first is with regard actually to intermediary liability. The right to be forgotten seeks to address an enormous problem of scale that is heretofore has never been seen and is enabled by these technologies in terms of information that was out there but is now accessible to people all over the world. This practical obscurity has in many ways disappeared, and that is a massive fundamental problem. However, in many ways the cure is potentially as dangerous as the disease. The right to be forgotten, I have written, represents a fundamental break from how we see defamation and also privacy doctrine. So for example, if you go through the entire opinion, you'll see that it doesn't actually require that information be untruthful. It doesn't require that it be unlawful. It doesn't even require the complainant to show that they were prejudiced in any way. It doesn't have to harm them. That's essentially a standardless standard. And I say that as a former full-time litigator. I know how hard these things can be to pin down. And again, this is coming from good intentions. The second is, clearly we want to protect national security. Recent events, I think, drive that home especially profoundly. We don't want to see the kind of acts and violence that all too frequently occur in this world. But many of the steps that have been taken in terms of mass surveillance have, I think, gone too far. They chill free expression. And those steps themselves have unintended consequences. So, for example, internet fragmentation, which was previously the province of China and Iran and Russia, are now being, we're seeing it in Brazil, we're seeing it in Germany as legitimate ideas, legitimate solutions, and many, many other potential solutions flowing from that are actually deeply, deeply problematic and don't necessarily even get to the root of the problem. As I wrote about the Marco Civil when we were looking, well, that was actually part of the debate. It was, there were many suggested ulterior motives for data localization and therefore fragmentation. So that's my point, is that we as civil society, we as governmental actors, we as academics have to be very careful that the solutions we are proposing are not actually making things worse and that they're actually getting to the root of the problem.
Thank you, Jeff. Now I'd like to turn to Arzu. Oh God, I'm gonna mess it up. Gebulayarova, sorry. She is actually a journalist, and so I thought it would be helpful to have the perspective of a freelance journalist here to talk about how internet governance, the press freedom dimensions, impact her. She's actually based here in Istanbul.
Thank you, Courtney. It's okay with my last name. It's very complicated and very long, I understand. Coming from Azerbaijan, in Azerbaijan, government takes internet governance close to heart, and it literally interprets internet governance as governing of internet the way it wants. And once a friend of mine said 2 years ago at the IGF, which was actually held ironically in Baku, that internet is free in Azerbaijan, but so is the government to do whatever it wants with who is using it. And so we have a lot of journalists at the moment who are in jail because they're using internet as their only means of publication, because there are no other independent or free outlets left. So that's one thing I would like to really focus on, that there are, I guess there's lack of mechanism in terms of holding those governments responsible that are using surveillance tools on journalists and bloggers, because in countries like Azerbaijan, if you're a blogger, you're automatically treated as a journalist, and the same charges that they use on journalists, which is not what they write. Basically, they don't put them in prison saying openly what they're putting them in prison for. They put them in prison for hooliganism, or they put them in prison for illegal drug sale or crimes as such, rather than their actual work. But they're doing this because they have very well-embedded surveillance mechanisms on all levels, whether it's from the phones, whether it's actually hacking their Facebooks and getting into their private messages and actually showing the exchange that they have with their friends while they're arrested at the police stations. And so there's this I feel like there's one of the internet governance issues is this lack of mechanism in terms of holding governments responsible, and also the companies, foreign companies that actually sell these surveillance tools, or companies like TeliSonera, which is a Swedish company, a telecom company, but actually is notorious in Azerbaijan for allowing for black boxes installation on their lines. And people are really concerned about this, but every time I talk to the TeliSonera representative at these forums, he says, you know, it takes time, we really need to negotiate with the government, but people still get arrested, and bloggers and journalists still thrown into jail. So that's, I think, one of my very main concerns at this forum. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we obviously covered a large range of issues, but I want to draw together that, just to throw this out there, we talk a lot about the multi-stakeholder dimensions of internet governance, how important it is to have a multi-stakeholder conference. We have a very multi-stakeholder group of people up here. And, you know, Guy brought up the idea of having journalists and media organizations potentially getting more involved in these debates. But then to what extent, you know, bringing up Arzu's point, and I think Wafa's as well, in terms of governmental responsibility. So we talk about multi-stakeholderism, but I don't recall hearing in those discussions any discussion about the responsibility of the different parties and whether they're, you know, acting in good faith, whether they're participating in these debates. Obviously, governments have many more resources at their disposal than, say, civil society. So, you know, how might that play into our considerations about press freedom? And, you know, with declining media budgets, is it realistic to think that media organizations and journalists have the capacity and the resources to participate effectively in these very complicated issues? So that's something to throw out there as well. Some of the key issues that I think were raised here, and what I'd like to do is ask people in the audience if you have perspectives that weren't issues that weren't addressed. So let me just sum that up, and then I'm going to go to Guthrie. So we heard about limits on the collection and use of data, source protection, data localization, proportionality with respect to blocking, and so that has to do with infrastructure, We talked somewhat, I think there's some lack of clarity about whether like internet regulation, legal regulation falls under internet governance or not. I think there's some debate in this forum about that. Domain name blocking, licensing, intermediate liability, surveillance, transparency of processes, and I wonder what happens when you combine the lack of anonymity with surveillance, with data retention. I mean, that could lead to a very Orwellian situation. Okay, Gayatri, could you introduce yourself and please make your comment? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Courtney. My name is Gayatri. I'm from the Southeast Asian Press Alliance based in Thailand. I'll try to make this really quick, but I have 4 points. The first is that particularly taking on the issue of whose responsibility and also the question of multi-stakeholderism. I think 3 challenges and 1 suggestion. First challenge is that the challenge of multi-stakeholderism is particularly prominent in countries where the impact of the controls online on media as well as individuals are the most prominent. So we cannot assume that there will be any meaningful engagement in those countries. So I think that that's something to take in very seriously, that at this level, we're talking about multi-stakeholderism, but when you go to the national level, it's precisely in those countries with the most restrictive regimes that you don't find the various stakeholders engaged meaningfully. So that's one. Second is, I think there's also assumption that all journalists are progressive. And I think we have to be very realistic that in these countries, again, the majority of the journalists are part of a very conservative system. And you would find many of them actually endorsing a lot of controls online and regulation of content online. So when you talk about free speech, when you talk about LGBT rights, you talk about religious expression, sometimes it's also the media that is promoting controls online. So I think we need to be very, very wary that media can also be representing a very dominant part of society. So I think reaching out to them to also look at how it impacts access to information, fair information, things like that. So I think that's an assumption we need to break and to recognize that we have to address it. Third, question about the right to be forgotten. I think it's yet to reach the other side of the world. But I think that here it could be possible to engage a new group, and that is, or at least to bring in the media, because I think with the right to be forgotten, we also realize that one of the biggest impact is the whole industry of archiving information, and in which media has been one of the biggest, largest bodies that archive information. So it's one thing to say to Google to take it down, but there's this whole treasure of information that media organizations hold, either behind paywall or through old formats. So I think the impact is greater in the sense of holding that information. So I think the archiving industry, and actually talking to not the journalists, but actually those in those archive departments, bringing them into the discussions could be very useful for press freedom. And the last point is, with the regulations, talking about defamation, talking about representation of the issues, against sedition, all the other charges, there is a lack of public interest in the whole legal framework, in the discussions, or at least in the judgments. So you'd find judgments regarding defamation, sedition, do not have strong public interest regime. And I think that we need to also pull that in. So it's good to say it's free expression, but it's not just that. There is, and particularly to defend bloggers and individuals, we need to push for a lot more public interest litigation in these countries. So that's a suggestion on where legal reforms could actually happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that contribution. Wafa.
I actually really appreciated your comments about the multi-stakeholder model, because that's something we're trying to figure that out on a global level, let alone a regional level. And so if we still don't know what multi-stakeholderism really means globally, then I think it's going to take a long, long time to define that. But moving on to your second point about you mentioned that a lot of regulatory authorities and governments that practice censorship or surveillance exist in very conservative societies. But I think I used the example earlier of a website in Jordan, and it wasn't the only website that was blocked. But if you look at other countries as well, you'll notice that there's a whole host and variety of excuses that regulatory authorities use in order to censor free expression. for example, in Tunisia, like there's the, well, I'll preface by saying that the convergence of national security, free expression, and terrorism is a very fatal mix, and it's very, very dangerous. And so we see that certain governments are using this rising threat of terrorism to arbitrarily take down websites without any type of due process of law. And so I think this only, what you said crystallizes the necessity of approaching this with a rights-based type of view and prioritizing human rights and free expression above other priorities, so to speak. So it's an ongoing conversation, and I really appreciated your comments on that. Thank you.
Please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yes. My name is John Reichertz. I'm from the Forum for Argentine Journalism. I wanted to know from a legal perspective, particularly Guy, if you could give us an idea, has anybody defined what the characteristics of a non-traditional journalist? If you went to court and you were not from a traditional media outlet, how could you prove that you were exercising journalism?
Well, there's no kind of total legally binding definition worldwide, but the UN Human Rights Council has made this point, exactly that journalism is broader. The United Nations Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists makes the same point. That's a document welcomed by the General Assembly. So it's really to use these in court situations to say, look, this is the international consensus on this because governments have signed up to these broader concepts.
Jeff, you wanted to make a point?
Oh, just that I've litigated similar cases.
And the UN Special Rapporteur has also commented in
albeit in Californian federal courts, and it often is a matter of just does what somebody's doing look like journalism? Are they taking raw information, are they then reprocessing it, turning it into a story, making it into something new and valuable that people can learn from? And I think that that's a much better test than some sort of means-based test or status-based test. That's more of a function. I'm actually the remote moderator, so I'm going to go to where should I be going, by the way? In the back of the room. So I'm going to go back there, but did want to make that point very briefly.
Okay, and I think it's about focusing on the act of journalism, maybe more so than the subject position of who is and is not a journalist. Okay, we had a question over here.
My name is Mogens Blikker Bjerregaard. I'm from the Danish Union of Journalists and also the European Federation of Journalists. I think it's very important not going to try to find a definition of journalists, because that will bring us in big difficulties when we're doing that. I think one of the key issues is actually the legislation where you see licensing. You see that you require the new media require licensing. This is one of the I see as one of the big problems. If you go back to basis, when newspapers came, it was free to print. It was free to publish. It was a part of the press freedom, a part of the free speech.
But sorry, I want to look forward, not backwards, right?
Yes,
so licensing,
yeah,
I mean, is
to
more...
look forward is to have the same approach for journalism online, and not using the electronic media, radio, TV, when you started making licensing and all these things. Now you have so many possibilities to create your own media, and you should do that.
Expand a little. If you did something based on sources, and you say, I'm protecting my sources because I'm a journalist, and the court says, no, I don't think you're a journalist.
Okay, but sorry, I'm going to cut this conversation off because this is trying to get beyond that discussion, because I want to talk about internet governance. What are key issues of internet governance that go beyond national frameworks for dealing with licensing of journalists? So I appreciate the comments. I think it is an important debate, but I want to put that on hold in this forum and kind of get to the next issue. And I want to throw out there to bring a couple of things together that were mentioned, which had to do with surveillance, with data retention, and with anonymity. And I want to ask the representative from Google, representing the private company, how there's a new Google drone, I believe, and Google glasses. How are these Internet of Things issues coupled with the surveillance that we know is occurring by the U.S. government and others, and then the data retention requirements? What are the implications? Have you guys thought about the implications to journalism, to the journalistic process, to the ability to protect sources? Is that on your agenda? And if so, could you talk about how and why?
Certainly. Data retention is an ongoing debate worldwide. It's interesting because you see different perspectives depending on the framework of human rights that each country or each region actually has. So for example, for quite a while, I can always speak a little bit more about Brazil because I'm based there. For quite a while, the issues of the lack of data retention were not even defended in Brazil. Basically, authorities always wanted data retention to be as long as possible for law enforcement purposes. So we had crazy ideas like, let's retain all data from our users for all services for 5-10 years, something along those lines. Civil society was key to that battle to make sure that policymakers understood where we were at and what kind of scenario that would create, an Orwellian scenario as you described. So in a way, I think a compromise has been reached in certain areas, and I want to highlight what Marco Seville did in that sense. It ended up having data retention for a bit. For example, application providers like Google, the way the law defines us, are supposed to retain data for up to 6 months. But if authorities want to get more data than those mandatory 6 months, they are supposed to get a court order, and they are supposed to make sure that there's a reason for that. So it was a compromise. But that happened before the recent European decision that struck down the data retention directive. So it's interesting to see how these debates flow, because up until then, Brazil and Latin America in particular, they usually look to Europe in inspiration for its own national laws. There's a strong tradition of that. So it's interesting to see how that debate will flow. How that relates to technology, how that relates to all of these new experiments, the new experiments, Internet of Things, and so on. Of course, it's always a concern. Any kind of product, any kind of new product that not only Google, but most of the Internet companies do, has always some sort of privacy concern. And basically, the way it's done is by gathering feedback at its earlier stages. So for example, for things like Google Glass, you may remember that way before the product was even on a prototype stage, people were already banning it on bars. So it was interesting to see the concerns were immediately there. And that led to some design changes. For example, everybody then said that there ought to be a light in the model to indicate that's recording something. So that's one example. That's something that was changed in between because of that kind of privacy concern and feedback. So yes, the companies are always looking out for that, are always hearing that kind of feedback. But I guess one particular point that has to be addressed is, to what extent do we actually want specific regulation on those points? Because that's one of the key debates that we are seeing worldwide. Basically, sometimes people say there ought to be a minimum level of protection provided by the state, and sometimes that kind of ignores people's choices. And I'll highlight this with one example from Brazil, as it happened with Street View. You may remember that Google has this product called Street View that shows you the actual location of the place you're looking on the maps. And we did what we called Street View in the Amazon region, in the Amazon River. So it wasn't so much Street View per se, more like a boat view, so to speak. But basically what happened was very interesting, because the local population there, they actually put on their best clothes. The girls actually put on their makeup because they thought they were going to be on the pictures. And basically, when we told them that by default, these images are all blurred because of privacy concerns, because we don't want people to identify other people via Google Street View, they were devastated. 2 of them actually wrote back to the office and said, no, I expressly authorized the... So it's...
crime that... error.
Thank you. Ronnie.
I think it's time for a healthy rebellion against some of the notions that I've heard here this morning. When you take a right and you balance it against another right, you are limiting it. And Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is unqualified. It's time to get back to basics. I agree with the gentleman. What's the way? We need to think about press freedom as a basic right and not concede to governments as we seem to do in so much of the discussion here this morning, the right to legislate away our rights. A proportional right is a limited right. A balanced right is a limited right. We should get away from hierarchies of rights. And we're making a big mistake in conceding the government the right to legislate away our rights.
Thank you, Ronnie. And I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Please introduce yourself.
This is Sridhi Prayamaji. I'm an ISOC ambassador and a blogger and an activist. I'd like to add a new perspective to this discussion. Criminalization of freedom of expression is yet another topic that is currently being focused in Nepal. In Nepal, recently, 2 of the fellow people were arrested just for commenting on a Facebook status. So, not just journalists, but bloggers and, individuals are being targeted as well. So that's it. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much. One last question. Please introduce yourself.
Amalia Toledo from a Colombian NGO, Carismas Foundation. In Colombia, we are experiencing some cases on court that is bringing us some of the concerns because the judiciary doesn't understand technology, doesn't understand how internet is working. So we have seen how.
Ronnie, I think you bring up a key point, which is that press freedom is a key top-level human right, as recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But that doesn't mean, that we don't need to grapple with how do we make sure that that right is enabled to be invoked and isn't detracted from by these new technologies. I want to ask Carlos if he has any last comments, since he didn't really get a chance to make a follow-up comment, and then we'll have to wrap up because we're at the end of our time.
No, so I'll be very quick since we have heard so many interesting topics here. But I would like just to stress the importance for us since we are going through this fine line between how to regulate those issues if there's need to regulate. So that's why it's so important this mentioning on do not regulate away or legislate away the rights of press. I think you have a thin line here to discuss how to better protect those liberties and protect those rights, either through hard law, soft law, and the other means in which we need to take extra care to make sure those rights will be duly enforced and duly protected. So that's why I think this discussion is so important, and I would say very relevant to the future of press freedom in internet governance and regulation. So that's all.
Thank you. I mean, if I just had to briefly summarize kind of with the press freedom dimensions of cybersecurity, of anonymity policies, et cetera, because I think a lot of times we don't really consider journalists or the impact on press freedom, but we have to remember that they play such a critical role in societies and in the information exchange between those in power and the general public. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists.
It was like a broadband speed panel.
Well, they only gave us an hour. All the other panels are an hour and a half.
Good job managing that, though, because it's a variety of issues.
Oh, thank you.
Really kept things in line.
Yeah, there's a ton of issues.
It's so many. I mean, we barely touched on the surface, but you actually, I was saying you did a good job managing the issues. Because it could have gone in 700 directions.
Right, and I mean, that's the point, is we're not here to have answers, but I want to throw out things to get people thinking so that when we, I'll do the report on this panel so that it's in there, and then that can help get other things on the agenda next year,
Of course.